A Japanese admiral sits in his command center, staring at a report he's read 5 times already. His hands won't stop shaking. The numbers can't be real. According to his intelligence officers, the Americans just built more aircraft carriers in 3 months than Japan has constructed in the past decade. He picks up his phone to call Tokyo, then puts it down. What's he supposed to say? That everything they were promised about American weakness was a lie. That the war they thought they'd already won is about to crush them. This is the story of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the man who watched Japan's naval superiority evaporate in real time, and how his desperate attempts to turn the tide only made things worse. Most people know about Pearl Harbor. They know about Midway. But there's a Japanese admiral whose story shows the complete arc of Japan's naval collapse better than anyone else. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa started the war as a confident, capable officer who believed in Japanese superiority. He ended it as a broken man who understood exactly how badly his country had miscalculated. Between those 2 points, he fought in some of the most desperate naval battles in history, watched his fleet get systematically destroyed, and came up with plans so desperate they involved using his own ships as bait. This is what happened when a proud naval officer had to face the reality that his enemy wasn't just stronger. They were operating on a completely different level. Ozawa wasn't some minor officer. By 1942, he was commanding major naval operations. He had graduated from the Japanese Naval Academy with honors. He'd been planning for war with America since the 1930s. Like most Japanese naval officers, he studied American naval doctrine, read about American ship designs, and analyzed how the U.S. Navy would likely fight. And like most of his colleagues, he came to a dangerous conclusion based on flawed assumptions. The Japanese believed that when war came, it would be decided by one massive fleet engagement. Battleships would line up and trade fire until one side was victorious. They had trained for this scenario for decades. Their entire naval strategy was built around it. There was just one problem with this plan. America didn't fight that way anymore. By the time war broke out, the U.S. Navy was already transitioning to carrier-based warfare. And they had the industrial capacity to build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. But in 1942, Ozawa didn't know that yet. He was still operating under the assumption that Japan's technical superiority and warrior spirit would overcome American numbers. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was, and the education would cost him almost everything. After Midway, the Japanese Navy was hurt but not destroyed. They had lost 4 carriers, but they still had operational carriers and a strong surface fleet. The problem was replacing what they'd lost. Japanese shipyards were already running at maximum capacity. There was no surge production available. Every ship took years to build, and every experienced pilot took years to train. Meanwhile, American shipyards were ramping up to production levels that Japanese planners thought were impossible. But Ozawa didn't know the full extent of this disparity yet. He was focused on the immediate problem. How to stop American advances in the Solomon Islands. This is where Ozawa really enters our story. In late 1942 and early 1943, he was given command of the Third Fleet, which included most of Japan's remaining carriers. His job was to support operations around Guadalcanal and prevent American forces from advancing further. It should have been straightforward. Japan still had more carriers in the area than America. They had more experienced pilots. They had land-based air support from nearby islands. On paper, they should have been able to stop the American advance cold. But something kept going wrong. Every time Ozawa planned an operation, American forces seemed to be one step ahead. His planes would find empty ocean where enemy carriers were supposed to be. His surface ships would run into ambushes. His supply convoys would get intercepted by submarines. What Ozawa didn't realize was that America had broken Japanese naval codes. They could read his messages almost as fast as his own commanders. Every move he planned, Americans knew about in advance. But even beyond that, there was a fundamental difference in how the two navies operated that Ozawa was just starting to notice. When Japanese pilots flew missions and didn't return, they were gone. Japan's pilot training program couldn't replace losses quickly. When American pilots got shot down, they often got rescued by submarines or seaplanes specifically sent to recover them. The Americans were treating their trained pilots as valuable resources worth risking ships to save. The Japanese were treating pilots as expendable warriors who should be honored for dying in combat. By mid-1943, Ozawa was starting to see a pattern that worried him. Japanese naval aviation was getting weaker even when they weren't losing major battles. Experienced pilots were being killed in small skirmishes. New pilots barely had training before being thrown into combat. Meanwhile, American pilots seemed to be getting more numerous and better trained. Their tactics were improving. Their planes were getting upgraded with better engines and weapons. Ozawa sent reports to Tokyo explaining that the quality gap was shifting in America's favor. Tokyo told him to stop making excuses and fight harder. The idea that American forces could become superior to Japanese forces was unacceptable to the high command. It contradicted everything they believed about racial superiority and warrior spirit. Let me tell you about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, because this is where Ozawa's world really fell apart. By June 1944, American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific. They had taken the Marshall Islands. They had bypassed strong Japanese positions and left them to wither without supplies. Now they were coming for the Marianas, a chain of islands that included Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were critical for Japan because they were close enough to the home islands that American bombers based there could reach Japanese cities. Losing the Marianas would mean Japan itself would be under direct air attack. Tokyo ordered the Navy to stop the American invasion at all costs. Ozawa was given command of the Mobile Fleet, which was basically everything Japan had left that could float and fight. He had 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers. On paper, it looked like a formidable force. Ozawa spent weeks planning his attack. He knew the Americans had more carriers, but he thought he had an advantage. Japanese carrier planes had longer range than American planes. That meant he could launch strikes while staying out of range of American counterattacks. He could hit them without getting hit back. It was a good plan. It should have worked. Except Ozawa was basing his strategy on outdated intelligence about American capabilities. Here's what Ozawa didn't know. The American task force waiting for him had 15 carriers. Not fleet carriers that would show up in intelligence reports. These were new Essex-class and Independence-class carriers that had been built so recently that Japanese intelligence didn't know they existed yet. American shipyards had been pumping out carriers so fast that Japan's intelligence network couldn't keep up. And these carriers had better planes, better radar, better everything than what Ozawa was expecting to face. His longer range meant nothing because American radar would detect his planes long before they got close enough to attack. June 19, 1944. Ozawa launched his first strike. Over 200 planes headed for the American fleet. He waited in his command center for reports of successful attacks. Instead, he got silence. Then fragments of radio messages. Planes being intercepted. Squadrons getting torn apart. Pilots screaming about overwhelming numbers of American fighters. Ozawa couldn't understand what was happening. His planes should have reached the American carriers before enemy fighters could intercept in force. But American radar had picked up his strike while it was still over 100 miles away. Fighter directors on American carriers had guided interceptors to perfect positions. Ozawa's attack waves flew into a meat grinder. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Out of the 200-plus Japanese planes in that first strike, only a handful made it back. Ozawa thought there must have been some mistake. Some communication error. He launched a second wave. Same result. A third wave. Massacred. By the end of the day, Ozawa had lost over 300 aircraft and 3 carriers. The Americans lost 29 planes. 29. Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. His pilots, some of the best Japan had left, had been slaughtered without even reaching their targets most of the time. But the nightmare wasn't over. American search planes found Ozawa's fleet late on June 20. American carriers launched a strike at extreme range, gambling that they could hit the Japanese fleet and recover their planes after dark. It was a risky decision, but American commanders knew they had the numbers to absorb losses. The strike found Ozawa's fleet and sank 2 more carriers. Damaged others. American planes flew back in the dark and many crashed trying to land on carriers at night. But the Americans had enough planes and pilots that they could afford the losses. Ozawa didn't. When he counted his remaining aircraft after 2 days of battle, he had fewer than 40 operational planes left. He had started with over 450. The mobile fleet wasn't mobile anymore. It was a collection of ships with almost no air cover. Ozawa retreated to Okinawa and sent his report to Tokyo. He tried to explain what had happened. How American fighter direction was perfect. How their planes seemed to be everywhere at once. How the numerical superiority was even worse than intelligence had suggested. Tokyo's response was to relieve him of command. Not officially, but they made it clear he had failed. The loss of the Marianas meant American B-29 bombers could now reach Japan. Cities would burn because Ozawa couldn't stop the American fleet. Except it wasn't his fault. He had been sent to fight with inadequate forces based on intelligence that was months out of date. But someone needed to take the blame. Here's where Ozawa's story takes a darker turn. Instead of being shuffled off to some minor post, he was given command again in October 1944. Why? Because Japan was desperate, and desperate countries make desperate plans. American forces were landing in the Philippines. If they succeeded, Japan would be cut off from its oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, the fleet couldn't operate. The army couldn't move. The war would be over. So the Japanese Navy came up with a plan so risky it bordered on suicidal. They would use every ship they had left in one massive operation to destroy the American invasion fleet. It was called Operation Shogo. Victory Operation. Except the plan required Ozawa to do something that no admiral wants to do. Deliberately sacrifice his ships to ensure someone else's success. The plan worked like this. Ozawa would take Japan's remaining carriers and sail toward the Philippines from the north. His carriers had almost no planes left, but that didn't matter. His job wasn't to attack. His job was to be bait. American carriers would detect his fleet and sail north to engage. While the Americans were distracted, 2 powerful surface fleets would come from the west and south, slip through the Philippines, and destroy the invasion fleet. It was elaborate. It depended on perfect timing. And it required Ozawa to sail knowingly to his own destruction. He was being asked to be a decoy, to throw away Japan's last carriers and his own life so that other commanders would have a chance at victory. Ozawa accepted the mission. What else could he do? Refuse and be branded a coward? The warrior code demanded absolute obedience. So in October 1944, he sailed north with 4 carriers, 2 battleships, and a handful of escorts. His carriers had maybe 100 planes between them. Barely enough to launch a token strike. He was sailing into battle with a fleet that couldn't fight. And he knew it. Officers who served with him during this operation said he was calm but distant. Like a man who had already accepted his fate. He gave his orders clearly. He made sure his crews understood their role. And then he waited to see if the Americans would take the bait. They did. Admiral William Halsey commanded the American carriers covering the invasion. When his scout planes reported Japanese carriers to the north, he made exactly the decision the Japanese were counting on. He took his entire fleet north to sink those carriers. Every American carrier. Every battleship. All of them went charging after Ozawa. Back in the Philippines, the invasion fleet was left protected by just a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The Japanese surface fleets approaching from the west and south now had a clear shot at thousands of vulnerable transport ships. October 25, 1944. American planes found Ozawa's fleet and began their attacks. Ozawa didn't even try to defend effectively. His few remaining planes launched a token strike toward the American fleet, but mostly his ships just sailed in formation while American bombs and torpedoes tore them apart. One carrier sank. Then another. His flagship took hit after hit but somehow stayed afloat. Ozawa transferred to a cruiser and watched his last carriers burn. Officers around him were weeping. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific in 1942. Now they were dying as bait in a desperate gamble. And Ozawa felt nothing. He had seen too much. Lost too many ships. Watched too many plans fail. This was just one more disaster in a war that had become nothing but disasters. But here's the twist. The plan almost worked. While Halsey was destroying Ozawa's decoy fleet in the north, Japanese surface forces actually reached the invasion fleet off Samar Island. A few escort carriers and destroyers were all that stood between Japanese battleships and thousands of defenseless transports. It should have been a massacre. Japanese victory snatched from defeat. Except the Americans fought with a ferocity that shocked the Japanese commanders. Destroyers made suicidal torpedo runs against battleships. Escort carriers launched every plane they had. Crews abandoned damaged ships and kept fighting from the water. And the Japanese admiral in charge of the surface fleet, Takeo Kurita, got spooked. He saw the desperate American resistance and convinced himself he must be facing a stronger force than intelligence indicated. He broke off the attack and retreated. The one moment where Japan's desperate plan might have worked, and the commander lost his nerve. When Ozawa heard that Kurita had retreated, he apparently laughed. Not a happy laugh. The bitter laugh of a man who had just sacrificed his fleet for nothing. He had done his job perfectly. He had drawn away the American carriers. He had given Kurita a clear shot. And Kurita had flinched. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history, and Japan lost decisively. 4 carriers gone. 3 battleships sunk. Multiple cruisers destroyed. The Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after that battle. And Ozawa had commanded the decoy fleet that bought nothing except more deaths. After Leyte Gulf, Ozawa was brought back to Tokyo. He expected to be court-martialed or forced to commit suicide. Instead, he was promoted. Made Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff. Not because he had done well, but because everyone above him was either dead or had already been disgraced. Japan was running out of admirals. The promotion was meaningless anyway. There was no fleet left to command. American submarines had sunk most of Japan's merchant marine. Oil tankers couldn't get from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The few remaining ships were stuck in port because there was no fuel to operate them. Ozawa spent the last months of the war in an office in Tokyo, watching the city burn from American firebombing raids, knowing there was nothing the Navy could do to stop it. Let me tell you about a conversation Ozawa had with a junior officer in early 1945. The officer asked him when the Navy would sortie again to attack the American fleet. Ozawa just looked at him and said there would be no more sorties. The officer protested. Surely they could gather enough fuel for one more decisive battle. One more chance to hurt the Americans badly enough that they'd negotiate. Ozawa told him to look at a map. Really look at it. American forces controlled everything from Hawaii to the Philippines. They had dozens of bases where they could repair and rearm their ships. Japan had a handful of ports and no fuel. Even if they somehow gathered every remaining ship for one final battle, what would it accomplish? Sink a few American ships. America would replace them in weeks. Japan couldn't replace anything. The war was over. They just hadn't officially admitted it yet. The junior officer was shocked. This was defeatist talk. Treasonous even. Ozawa didn't care anymore. He had watched the entire Japanese Navy get systematically destroyed over 3 years. He had seen plan after plan fail because they were based on assumptions about American weakness that had never been true. He had been sent on a suicide mission that accomplished nothing. What was Tokyo going to do to him now that would be worse than what he'd already experienced? The officer left and apparently reported the conversation because Ozawa was questioned by military police. But they didn't arrest him. Because deep down, everyone in the naval headquarters knew he was right. They were just too invested in the warrior code to admit it out loud. Here's what really broke Ozawa, according to people who knew him in those final months. It wasn't the battles he lost. It wasn't the ships that sank. It was the production numbers. American intelligence officers who interrogated him after the war said he was obsessed with asking about American shipbuilding. He wanted to know exactly how many carriers America had built. How many planes? How many ships of every type? When they told him the numbers, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said something like this: "We were fighting 2 different wars. We were fighting to win battles. You were fighting to win production. We never had a chance. Because that was the truth Ozawa had figured out too late. All the tactical brilliance, all the warrior spirit, all the careful planning meant nothing against an enemy that could absorb losses and come back stronger. When Japan lost a carrier, it took years to replace. When America lost a carrier, they had 2 more already under construction. Japanese pilots trained for months before being thrown into combat. American pilots trained for over a year and then had backup pilots training behind them. Japan was playing checkers while America was playing chess, and by the time Japanese commanders realized it, the board was already lost. August 15, 1945. Ozawa listened to the emperor's surrender announcement in his office in Tokyo. Officers around him were weeping, some were raging about continuing the fight, some were quietly reaching for their sidearms to commit suicide rather than face the shame. Ozawa did none of those things. He sat at his desk and started writing. Pages and pages of notes about what had gone wrong. Where Japanese intelligence had failed. Which assumptions had been incorrect. How American capabilities had been consistently underestimated. He wrote like a man trying to make sure someone would learn from these mistakes. Like maybe if he documented everything clearly enough, future generations would understand how completely Japan had miscalculated. American occupation forces found these notes when they took control of naval headquarters. They brought them to Ozawa during his interrogation. Asked him to explain what he meant by certain sections. Ozawa answered everything they asked. Completely. Honestly. In detail. Other Japanese officers saw this as collaboration. Betrayal. Ozawa saw it as his final duty. The war was over. Japan had lost. The only thing left was to make sure the truth was recorded. That someone understood exactly how badly they had been beaten and why. He told American interrogators things that shocked them. How little fuel Japan had in the final year. How poorly trained the replacement pilots were. How the entire strategy after Midway had been based on hoping America would lose the will to fight rather than any realistic path to victory. One American officer asked Ozawa when he personally realized Japan would lose. Ozawa thought about it and said he knew for certain after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That was when he saw that America wasn't just numerically superior. They were technologically superior, tactically superior, and operating with an intelligence advantage that made Japanese plans predictable. But, he admitted, he should have known even earlier. Anyone who looked at the production numbers should have known. Japan was producing hundreds of planes per month. America was producing thousands. The math was simple. Japan could win every battle and still lose the war. Which is essentially what happened. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's story is different from other Japanese commanders because he actually figured out what was happening while it was happening. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't clinging to propaganda about Japanese superiority. By mid-war, he understood exactly how outmatched Japan was. But that knowledge didn't help him because the system he was part of couldn't accept reality. When he reported that American capabilities were beyond what intelligence suggested, he was told he was making excuses. When he tried to explain that the production disparity made victory impossible, he was accused of defeatism. So he kept fighting battles he knew couldn't be won, executing plans he knew wouldn't work, watching ships and men get destroyed for nothing. What makes Ozawa's story tragic is that he ended up being exactly the kind of decoy he was at Leyte Gulf. Not just in that battle, but in the entire war. He was sent out to perform missions that looked aggressive and bold but were really just buying time for leaders who couldn't admit defeat. His sacrifice of the carrier fleet in October 1944 was supposed to enable a great victory. Instead it was the final gasp of a dying navy. And Ozawa knew it. He sailed to that battle knowing his ships were bait, knowing the chances of success were minimal, knowing that even if the plan worked perfectly it would only delay the inevitable. That's not courage. That's something darker. That's a man who has been broken by reality but is still following orders because he doesn't know what else to do. After the war, Ozawa lived quietly. He didn't write memoirs glorifying his service. He didn't join groups of veterans insisting Japan had been winning until the atomic bombs. He just existed, answering questions when asked, providing information to historians, and occasionally commenting that Japan had fought the wrong war in the wrong way against the wrong enemy. He died in 1966, mostly forgotten except by military historians who recognized that his story captured the entire arc of Japan's naval defeat. From confidence to confusion to desperate gambles to bitter acceptance. Ozawa lived through all of it and understood it better than most. That understanding didn't save him or his fleet, but at least he died knowing the truth about what happened. Which is more than a lot of Japanese generals could say. Check out the next video for another untold World War II story.